Hi, welcome to my video. This is the first gaming YouTube video I've ever made. I have no idea how it's going to turn out, but I kind of got inspired on this particular topic. So here's a video about how I have kind of built out my basic atmospherics for my new Vulcan build. I would consider this to be a kind of starter setup for the first tier of a self-sustaining base. Part of the reason I'm making this video is because I have built a few Vulcan builds now, and I've watched a lot of content creators do Vulcan builds as well. I've learned tons of things from those content creators, but sometimes I think they don't go quite slow enough to kind of show the minimum viable base. And in some cases, I feel like some people build systems that are quite a bit more complicated than they probably need to be. So let's talk about that. The first thing I want to talk about generally is this is the sum total of kind of the atmospherics that I have for a relatively small survivable base. I have a greenhouse inside, breathable atmosphere, starting to work on sleeping quarters, etc. Not a huge base, but fully livable. And I'll show that in a couple minutes. I believe in the recording you'll hear some screeching and some. So let's talk about the system that's doing the screeching first. And also note that currently it's nighttime on Vulcan. That's kind of important because I tend to build my atmospheric systems, I think like most people do on Vulcan, where all of the fun stuff happens at night and almost nothing happens during the day. And so that's what's going on right now. So one of the first things I'm going to talk about is the systems that I usually build as soon as I can get kind of the materials and get set up. So usually as soon as I get some kind of breathable atmosphere going in my starter base, maybe I've thrown some plants down, and then my kind of immediate goal is to, one, get some CO2 going. The CO2 serves the purpose, obviously, of feeding the plants, but it also becomes basically the heat sink for a number of other systems in the base. So this is kind of the first thing I try to get up and running. And my automation typically tries to maintain about 4 MPa at night. That seems like a nice round number and has always served me sufficiently, so I don't worry about collecting more. The other thing I usually build as soon as I start building on my CO2 is in parallel. I basically build pollutant collection and an open loop cooler for that pollutant that I collect. And the primary role of this open loop pollutant cooler is to manage the temperature of the CO2 tank at a reasonable level so that it becomes a good battery or heat sink for other pieces of the system. I will be talking about too, and I just wanted to mention, is that I do have a number of chips for automation here. While I probably have more than I need, I like to keep my separations concerned, and the code that's running on those chips is actually pretty simple. So let's talk about that too at some point here. So 4 MPa in the CO2 tank, that's not particularly amazing. I do have an automation that basically runs an active vent up top. You can kind of see the corner of it here. And that CO2 is being pulled in by a couple of collectors. I find that I kind of need two here to keep up. CO2 collection is a little bit slow. And, you know, it's a pretty simple system. Bring in nighttime atmo, filter out CO2, shove it in the tank. Pretty straightforward. I also use CO2 for jetpack fill. And I'm just going to show this since I'm talking about CO2. I actually put CO2 into the closed loop cooling system, and that's what it uses for. It's the heat sink that it manages at a lower temperature, and that's where the base also gets its supply of CO2 from for plants and things of that nature. So notice here we're somewhere around 80 degrees Celsius. I think that's what I have the evaporator set to. What did I set it to? So 4,500. So this closed loop pollutant is spending all of its time basically just trying to get this temperature down to the set point. The creaking is because we're running a big vent, that big gray box up top, and that is pushing pressure into this set of pipes here. And you can kind of see down below, we've got our condensation valves. This is a pretty typical setup. And we're attempting to collect that liquid pollutant, again, simply for use in the open loop evaporator that we kind of see in the back there. The automation that I use to kind of manage this fill process that runs the big vent and then ultimately to provide pollutant into the liquid pollutant collection does manage this, and so I'm only collecting about 400 liters into this system. Here again, it's a number that seems to work. I don't see the need to build up an excess amount of pollutant at this time. So that's just kind of a number that I use, and I usually use 150 liters during the course of the day, kind of keeping the CO2 tank down to the temperature I'm looking for. And it turns out as well that as I'm collecting atmosphere, mostly for the purposes of collecting liquid CO2, I am also collecting volatiles out of that pressurized gas for the purposes of making fuel, which we'll talk about in a minute. So that's kind of these two components, and these are usually the things I build first. So at some point, I will start to set up the tank of H2, and that's not usually a big priority for me right away, but at some point, and here again you can kind of see I seek to fill this thing to about 4 MPa when the systems are running at night, and that's just kind of a threshold that I've picked. I also want to talk briefly, and then we'll talk in more detail. This is my fuel mix tank. We kind of see, I usually try to keep about 2 MPa on hand, and I do have this also automated to fill. And that fills basically from this smaller inline tank of oxygen, which I'm obviously mixing with the H2 through this mixer system here. And one of the things that I do that I think is a little simpler than what others might do is I rely basically on using simple heat exchange. So there's nothing particularly mechanical. There's not any real energy required. I simply sink the temperature of the H2 tank to the CO2 tank through a heat exchanger. And then similarly, I then sink the tank, this tank of oxygen, also through this simple heat exchanger so that they align in temperature so that the fuel mix comes out correctly. And I have a little bit of automation that actually watches the temperature between these two, and when they get close enough in temperature, the mixer will start up and run so long as the condition is true that they're both close enough in temperature to get us the kind of mix that we want. Here again, this is an attempt at simplicity. Instead of writing scripts that try to do gas mixing of gases for temperatures, I just rely on kind of a natural organic temperature sinking process through the heat sinks. And then when it gets to the right synchronous temperature, the mixer will go ahead and run and try to basically deliver some more fuel to the fuel tank. All of this is automated. The only thing at this point left on this atmospheric stack that requires manual intervention is that I do from time to time right now use a pump to draw from my main oxygen supply, which is coming in from the greenhouse, and that pumps basically into my inline tank. I keep these separate so that they can sync together. I also find it convenient to have a little less oxygen so that the synchronization of temperature can happen faster. And this is fully automatable at this point to basically do occasional injections of oxygen. I just haven't gotten around to it, and I only have to do it once in a while. The only place right now where fuel is important is in making water. So let's talk about water a little bit on the assumption that we know we're collecting pollutant. We're running basically this open loop pollutant pooler, pollutant or CO2 cooler, and that is managing the temperature on this tank, and that becomes the thermal battery for our closed loop, and also becomes a source of CO2 for some of the other systems that we need. And I'm going to go inside real quick and get something to eat. I may cut this out of the video, I don't know. I should have done this before I started the video. I'm glad everybody's got to see me eat. An enthralling video so far. Okay, should have done that first. So let's go back outside. You can also see that the greenhouse and living area inside is not particularly big, but good enough for a starter base for now. Okay, so when we last left off, I was talking about how I'd maybe show off a little bit about how the water system works. Obviously, fuel is a requirement for making water, and it's daylight outside right now, so it's not currently running, but I can talk about how it works when it is. One of the things I do with my water making system is that this whole system sort of works naturally. There's very little automation in the water production itself. I have automation to make sure that there's always fuel available. I use a pressure regulator in there to kind of put some amount of fuel in the fuel inlet pipe. And then the only other thing that really happens here is I have an automation that when we get to nighttime temperatures, it simply turns on this transformer and powers the system. There also is technically on that automation, I turn on the Stirling engine because you don't want gas in the engine during the heat of the day or it'll get explodey. So when you turn it off, it returns all the gas. So it's basically when it gets the right nighttime temperature, there's one little piece of automation that basically turns this guy on and turns the power on. That's all it does. The combustor starts running just naturally, just like the combustor would, starts drawing fuel. I actually run it through the Stirling engine, and as far as I'm concerned, even if you didn't need the electricity, even if you had electricity coming out of your behind, I always build my water making system with the Stirling engine in line, because A, it gives you basically 5 kilowatts of free energy while the water maker is running, and that's great on Vulcan, especially in the winter, but 2, it actually provides a tremendous amount of cooling before you have to deal with any of it. So I can't remember, but I think it comes out of here maybe 300C, something like that. I'd have to go verify it. So obviously come up and through, combustors running, there's no automation, there's no magic, it's just drawing from the fuel supply over here. And then we get to a water filtration system. There's probably more than one way to skin this cat. I could probably do something with phase change, but I don't. And again, there's no magic within the filtration system. It simply comes on when the power comes on and starts doing its job. Similarly, this volume pump here turns on when the system gets powered on, and it's just set to pull maximum throughput. We then get basically just steam into this portion of the network, and using this radiator, again, this is only always running at night. Never runs during the day, so this comes down to kind of nighttime temperature and basically brings the temperature down probably another 100.5 C. And I am not even sure that I'm glad I had that. That this even second radiator is really honestly necessary. I think it might actually be slightly overkill. And then all that basically just naturally condenses as the system is running and dumps liquid into this pipe. By the time the liquid gets into this pipe, I think it's somewhere around 90 or 100 C or something like that. But one of the other techniques I use is I actually keep some amount of pressure kind of behind in the pipe, which causes its rise and fall in temperature to come a little slower. And as a result of keeping a little bit of water on tap at all times, whenever it starts injecting water, it's slower to change the temperature of the water. And basically all day and night, I have a very simple phase change cooler over here that's constantly working to lower the water temperature in this particular pipe. So given that we have a little water always on tap when the system is running, and it's only injecting, probably 2 liters of water a night, it's also constantly trying to keep this thing cool by leveraging our closed loop cooling system to basically do phase change cooling on the water. And then I'll show how that works. This then leads into the greenhouse, and we have distribution of water inside the greenhouse through kind of another valving system. Our closed loop is really simple. It's just 2 exchangers. I'm using basically the purge valve technique here to kind of try to draw a little bit of heat back into the system as we're circulating. This is a pretty standard setup. We got our evap on one side, we got our condensation on the other. I'm evapping at I think at about 20 degrees Celsius or something like that, so that's my typical target, and we're pretty close to that now. We're always dumping a little bit of heat in the system because we're always basically making water at night, and it's always working on trying to cool itself down just a little bit as it sits here in the pipes, and it's leveraging our closed loop system. So there's always a little heat going through the system. One of the things that I haven't seen people talk about a lot is what the numbers are for these systems in terms of like how much gas and pollutant you probably want in it. And what I have learned over time is that when this system is at steady state, in other words, if I wasn't cooling a little bit of hot water all the time or whatever, I settle down to steady state at about 20 liters of liquid in reserve behind 20 liters of liquid in a fully filled evaporation chamber. So this represents about 40 liters of total liquid in the system. Again, a little bit of that we currently have over here in gas form because it's waiting to be pulled in by the condenser, and because it is actually doing work. And I have found with the 20 plus 20 in reserve that, and having a little bit of buffer on the condensate hot gas side, that seems to be a good number that leaves the cooler being pretty effective for most any workload that I've been throwing at it. So that's kind of the exterior of this thing. Let's talk let's go inside and let's talk about kind of what happens inside, and then we'll come back out and we'll talk just a smidge about some of the code and what I do, and I think you'll see that it's all fairly simple. What time is it? Oh, it's going to be nighttime again, so let's go outside. I just kind of wanted to show the magic here as the old sun goes down, or black hole, or Janus, or whatever we're calling that thing these days. So what we should see here, hopefully, in just a second. Well, we got to get down a little bit further in temperature here. We're still at, what, 140, 139. Oh, and I think something else that I'm not sure if people talk about when they build, but I use 2 one-way valves on my atmospheric collection to pressurize for pollutant, and that seems to get me to about 10 or 12 MPa, so there's no mechanical management or no automated management of the pressure inside the pipes collecting atmosphere. It's just kind of a natural side effect of adding a couple one-way valves to just slow the release of the air from the system. So we're getting pretty close. 127-ish. I probably actually should raise this up maybe to 128 or 129. I could get just a little bit more. Okay, and there we go. We can kind of see literally it just turns the power on. All the rest of the devices just turn themselves on. And this thing gets turned on by a little bit of automation and starts making power. And I guess while we're here, we can talk about this. I can't even tell you what the temperature that is because it sucks it out pretty quick. Yeah, obviously super hot over here. And then we can talk, so we'll just talk about this. So on this side over here, we're at about 140 something C with the water vapor. And then that's condensing, obviously, into the system. We can kind of see it rising up a little bit here. It'll usually get to 35, 40 C, and then again, the internal phase change cooler in there during the course of the day will kind of cool it back down to kind of a much more usable temperature. And let's just talk about the inside a little bit. So this is the way I build my inside stuff. Again, there's just a smidge of automation in here that's relevant to sort of the overall HVAC system. One of them is that I do have automated collection of oxygen from the greenhouse to dump in the primary O2 supply, and so I tend to manage the greenhouse. I'm a little bit under the pressure I want to be in here because I don't have enough nitrogen, so I've actually raised my CO2 up a little bit. I'm normally running at like 1 to 2% CO2, and then I usually try to run 30-ish% O2 at pretty close to 100 kPa of pressure. It's usually where I try to go, and then I control the pressure through nitrogen, but I just don't have enough on hand right now to get it exactly where I want. But this kicks on at thresholds, so it basically turns itself on somewhere around 24% and then tries to bring us back down to whatever the number is, 23%. Or sorry, like 31% down to 30%, something like that. So it vacillates basically between somewhere around 29, 28% to 30% for total concentration of oxygen as a percentage in here. This is basically the base AC, and this is basically connected to the closed loop cooling pipe outside. So the inside air conditioner is maintaining a set temperature and doing all of its heat sinking basically to the CO2 being cooled by the closed loop cooler. You can kind of see that here. So that's our CO2 closed loop cooler. And then kind of up here also we have a little bit of automation. So that is actually the CO2 pump. So that pulls CO2 from the closed loop cooling sink. And then there is a pressure regulator that makes sure that this basically stays at MPa, and that pulls from the primary CO2 tank as needed, and then tries to keep, and then the closed loop tries to keep this at around 20 something degrees Celsius. And so we can talk a little bit about that automation. I don't know if people find this interesting. Let's talk about the IC greenhouse. This is fairly simple. The first thing it does is it basically runs my grow lights based on the angle of the sun. So I don't use a timer here because that makes adding code to this thing to do other kinds of things tricky, is if you're doing sleeps. So I just basically track solar angle, and that seems to work pretty good for me. And then we have the gas sensor here, where what I'm doing is kind of got a bad gas management system here. So that's this guy in case anything sneaks into the greenhouse. I've got a little bit of code that'll start that thing up and get rid of it. Or sorry, this is the ratio of carbon dioxide. That's not the bad gas. And so this guy's just trying to manage the overall ratio of carbon dioxide and turns on the previously mentioned volume pump as required to kind of bring a little CO2 in as needed. This is the bad gas system, so this is me looking to see whether there's ratios of pollutants or volatiles, and if so, to go ahead and kick on the filtration system that manages that. And I think that's all for this. I do have an IC that's running the oxygen collection. That's also relatively simple. Oh, and that's actually technically outside for reasons because I need access to the other tank. So let's go back outside real quick and we'll just briefly look at a couple of the ICs out there. And I think that'll be about what I want to accomplish for this video. So if we come back out here, turn this on, let's talk about the CO2 IC first. Import. And so this is really simple CO2 stuff. Kind of sets the two filtration atmospherics units basically to be in active state. Turns the vent on, or actually sets them to active state of off, and the vent's off. Then checks the temperature, basically decides are we at nighttime temperature, and if so, so that we know that we can start to do work. Then we're checking the pressure in the tank and saying, is it 4,000 or less? And if those conditions are true, then we go ahead and turn we manage the CO2 pump, which basically pulls the CO2 collected from the filtration systems into the tank, manages the state of the two filtration systems and the state of the vent. It's really pretty straightforward. And we can still hear all that creaking in the background. So let's talk about, I'll show this guy. This one's also pretty straightforward. Are we at nighttime temperature? Do we have, actually in this case I'm checking, do we have more than 400 liters of pollutant liquid collected? We also check the pressure in those vessels because we don't want to get them higher than like 5,500. It's a number that I'm setting. And that's why we hear the creaking, and then it either turns the collection, the vent on or off, allowing pollutant to collect or not collect. The way I'm also doing that is so that I can get easily to 400 liters is I overpressurize when it's filling, and then I bleed off that pressure to get it to stop creaking through this purge valve. So I'm sort of fighting pressure to get it to fill, but then I'm fighting pressure again to get it to stop making noise. And that probably is the only bits that are particularly interesting in terms of like the automation. I don't think, well, fuel mixing might be of interest simply because there's actually a command in IC in MIPS that people may not be aware of that's actually really, really useful if you want to build an organic gas mixer, but you don't want to have to worry about like calculating the mixture based on pressure or I'm sorry, not pressure, but temperature, because I know those algorithms exist and I've used them before, but I use this system instead. So basically here we're saying, hey, if we need to make some fuel, which means we're under my 2000 kPa or 2 MPa goal, and if we have oxygen in our small inline tank, then we should proceed with trying to make fuel. This is where kind of the magic is that I basically look at the temperature of the oxygen and the temperature of the H2 tank, and I'm asking, basically using this instruction, whether they're basically within 1% difference in temperature of each other. And if it's true, that basically means they're pretty much at the same temperature, and it means at that point I can actually run the pump in the mixer. Is kind of what's happening there. So this is, I think, a really interesting instruction that I'm not sure if everybody's aware of, which allows you to kind of ask if two numbers are kind of within a percentage distance of each other. Super useful for something simple like this by saying, are these two things close to the same temperature? If they are, go ahead and do the thing you want to do. So I think that's about all I really wanted to show today. Again, the emphasis being that while I have some fairly simple IC10 automations just for managing whether something should be on or whether something should be off based on some basic thresholds around pressures, temperatures, that sort of thing, everything else is pretty simple, pretty mechanical. My fuel system obviously wouldn't scale very well if I was trying to launch rockets. So when I get to the point of trying to build rockets, I'm going to have to revisit how I make fuel, how quickly I can make fuel, whether I need to put stronger systems in place that can, operate under and produce more under conditions. But for right now, I'm water surplus, I'm fuel surplus, I'm oxygen surplus. Everything's a surplus, so I've got no concerns. And so that's my Vulcan sort of entry level atmospherics build.